Martha Stewart, when she came back, how did you go about kind of reinventing the image after a small personal mishap?
Martha really invented lifestyle. There were great cooks, there were great designers. Martha was someone who put it all together. She has a show with Snoop Dogg. You have to have that kind of conviction. The first thing I said, "So Oprah, are you in?" And she looked at me and she said, "Now I know why you're here."
Platforms at this point are having to take a view on freedom of speech.
Companies didn't need to have that identity before.
You have a right to be in the workplace. You have a right to say, "I think that's a hostile work environment." It's one of those things where you kind of learn how to think in a different way. After my first year of law school, going to the airport, and there's arrivals and departures. And I'm looking at the sign and saying, well, I'm arriving, but then I'm departing. So where am I going? And I'm like, wow, law school's messed up my head.
Hello and welcome to Women Who Roar. It's female leaders talking about crushing work, money, and life. I'm Shreya Chaubey.
I'm Sarah Walter.
And I'm Jess Jackson.
Lisa has one of the most impressive resumes we've ever seen. She was CEO of Alexander Wang. She was key in launching Gwyneth Paltrow's blog and commerce brand Goop, serving as their CEO. She served as first the president and then the CEO of Martha Stewart. She co-founded Oxygen Media and remained its president and COO until the company's sale to NBC. She also served as CEO of the Weather Channel after it was acquired by NBC. If that weren't enough, she started her career as a lawyer after obtaining her law degree at Rutgers, working at a variety of law firms, one of which she co-founded. And she currently sits on the board of Hasbro, MoneyLion, and Bill Ackman's SPAC. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
So obviously you have an extremely impressive background, and there's a million things I could ask you about.
That was the most CEOs we've ever heard in one intro before.
And COOs and founders.
It's just everything, right? But I am very selfishly going to ask the question that I think, after hearing that, everybody probably wants the answer to. So Martha Stewart, right? She obviously went away for a little while, from her business endeavors, right? I'm a little bit curious, when she came back, how did you go about kind of reinventing the image and making sure that the brand was still successful, after you have, we'll say, a small personal mishap, on your hands?
Well, a few things. I wasn't there when Martha came back from being away, but when she did come back, while she was away, many of the advertisers didn't want to support the business anymore, and many of the people she did transactions with did not want to do business because of the incident. However, when she came back, they all came back initially, and the business was really excelling. But what happened, which a lot of people forget about, in 2007 and 2008, there was a huge financial recession, which impacted advertising businesses and all businesses everywhere. And that probably was the biggest impact to her business individually. But that said, that brand is just an iconic brand. And when you have an iconic brand, you have to think to yourself, I have an iconic brand. I know there's a business out there. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with the business. And I remember thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, people are tired of Martha Stewart and they don't want to do it themselves and everybody's working. It's a little bit like I'm working, I don't have time to carve pumpkins. But my kids, who at the time were probably, 15 and 9, and I was talking about it, said to me, "Oh my God, Mom, this is the coolest brand and job you've ever had." So it really made me think, okay, I'm missing it. What is it about this brand? What is it about this brand that people love, that people have forgotten about? And I think what it was Martha really invented lifestyle. There were great cooks, there were great designers, there were great individual tastemakers. But Martha was someone who put it all together for people. And yes, she was more detailed than most. And yes, she did everything the long way, but it was what people really loved about it. So when I thought about it, it's like, I have to figure out how to get that back into the culture because we've forgotten about it. So to me, it was about how do we celebrate her as the creator of the lifestyle genre. So we came up with this idea that we would do an event celebrating lifestyle entrepreneurs and artisans. And we did a big contest in the magazine. We had them come on her television show. We had them on her radio show. And we had a lot of submissions for people who wanted to be part of this, and we picked 10. And then we did a big event in Vanderbilt Hall in New York City. And the mayor came, and the head of the small business unit came in Washington, and all of her advertisers were so excited. But what was hard initially was, for Martha, was we weren't celebrating Martha as the tastemaker. We were celebrating other people as a tastemaker. And that initially did not exactly make as much sense to her. However, she fully participated. She loved the event, which we called American Made. So we only picked American artisans. There was someone who made cheese in Vermont. I mean, it was really beautiful. And after that event, there was an article in the New York Times on the front page that was about Martha it was titled Martha Stewart, the Original Hipster. And it was fantastic. And it was the first time the press was talking about her and talking about what she had accomplished instead of what had happened in the past. And that was the beginning of the recreation of that brand.
That's awesome.
It was super fun.
I think I think a lot of work and thought goes into being able to take something that is a really salacious headline, right? Like if you're the media, of course, this is what you want to talk about, and turning it into something else, right? Being able to say, actually, that's not the most interesting story to put on the front page of whatever you're selling. The brand that we're trying to sell is, you know?
Yeah, it's hard to communicate. I mean, look, building brands is really hard. It's hard to find what the center of any brand is. And remember when we started Oxygen and we were building a brand for women, our idea is this is going to be easy. The only television brand out there for women is Lifetime. And, you know, it was mostly about, you know, diseases and victims. And we
Christmas
wanted...
movies.
Yes, exactly. We wanted...
Which for the men in my family love Lifetime.
Yeah, which we wanted to do something different. Like what did women really want? And we spent a lot of time trying to figure that out because it's not that obvious because women are not one creature. You know, you have people at different phases of their lives. They're single, they're going out, they get married, they have children, and then their careers. There's so many different aspects. So what is it that women really wanted from entertainment? And that was a really difficult thing to figure out. That was the hardest part about it. And I think lots of people have different ideas about it, and it's hard to test things on television because you never really know if it's the promotion or it's the programming or what's really making it work. And we ultimately ended up selling Oxygen to NBC, and I would say the only thing that was hard about that was I'm not sure we really ever quite figured it out, other than to know that Talk Sex with Sue Johansson, who was 75 years old, she was someone's grandmother, was very popular. The woman clearly cared about sex. And the other really popular show, which to this day is, I think it's one of the longest running shows now, it was called Snapped. It was like a docu-reality show about women who kill their husbands. They snap.
Oh, I would watch the hell out of that.
Everybody watched it. Oh my God. Everybody watched it. But it was really hard to figure out what else there was in the female genre that people wanted to see.
I mean, if you can answer the question what women want,
yeah, exactly.
Like, you'll never have to work a day in your life ever again.
They just want to be understood.
Yeah. But brand development's very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess a question on the brand thing. When you joined Martha Stewart, did you feel like there was some like resistance on behalf of kind of the original advertisers or people to be associated with the brand? Or were you able to like hit the ground running just because the power of the entire brand and not just Martha was just so strong?
I think we had to convince advertisers why it was relevant. That's what I think we had to do. And I don't think that was hard because there was such a strong, remember, there were two parts to that business. There were magazines, a television show, Sirius radio program, but there was also a gigantic business of merchandising. We had a licensing arrangement with Macy's, Home Depot, I forget which pet company it was, one of the big pet chains. We had a lot of product in the marketplace. So we had lots of acceptance on the one side from a merchandising side. It was the advertising side. But that, again, people forget during a recession, the first thing that gets cut in any budget is marketing.
Right.
That is the first thing that people cut. It's usually a big chunk of money that goes out the door every year. People are unsure what worked and what didn't work, and they cut it.
Having worked with Martha and Gwyneth, I'm just curious to get your take on how much of the brand is the individual, and what do you think it is about the brands that make them long-lasting? Why has Martha and Gwyneth potentially going to survive for so long and be relevant for so long?
That's interesting. I mean, to answer your first question is how much of the Martha Stewart company was Martha for many, many years, most of it. She had incredible people with her who worked with her in each of the different platforms that she was on. And each of the, like, one of the great wedding experts, Darcy Miller, was like the editor-in-chief of the Weddings magazine. And she was phenomenal. And she had multiple different people who worked in magazines who were fantastic chefs, and they were phenomenal. But at the end of the day, overall, when we were making decisions about anything that was going to appear anywhere, Martha made that call. In fact, there was a rule on recipes that every recipe had to be made 5 times before it was published. And there was a second rule that Martha had to taste it. And I'll never forget this. One time I'm walking with Martha. She was filming her show, and they came over because I guess they had done the food 5 times. And they really wanted to get the magazine out, and they had the food on a plate. And like, Martha, you have to taste this. She goes, oh, I can't taste that. Lisa, you taste it. She's like, okay. So I tasted it. I'm like, wow, that's so good. She looks at it. Never forget. She says, needs more lemon. How did you know that? But she was right. She just was incredible. Her taste level was just unbelievable. And I would say, I think Gwyneth has that kind of taste level too. Not seeing her taste food, in the air, but she's a fantastic cook. She's just absolutely fantastic. Her aesthetic's amazing. And I think people recognize that. And I also think with both of them, they can both be, even though Martha wasn't as much early in her career, but she certainly is now, controversial. And they're not afraid to be controversial. They're not afraid of someone saying they don't like something they said. I mean, look at Martha's close to 80, maybe 79, and she has a show with Snoop Dogg. I mean, that's relevance beyond. I mean, someone to realize that. And I think, she wasn't afraid to do that. And, Gwyneth hasn't been afraid to call her products names that people might find offensive. Like, this candle smells like my vagina. Someone might find that offensive, but she's not afraid to do that. She's not afraid for what people will say. It's what she thinks about, what she either thinks is funny or it's what she wants to do. And having that clarity of thought, I think, keeps a person who is so closely associated with the brand, and they both are, even though Goop is not called Gwyneth Paltrow, it's G-O-O-P.
Right.
I mean, it's Gwyneth Paltrow. And, Martha Stewart's been Martha Stewart for a long time. And I think you have to have that kind of conviction.
Can I ask a controversial question while we're on the topic of Gwyneth?
Maybe.
So how do you feel about sort of some of the commentary from people that Gwyneth is maybe a little out of touch with her customer base? So things like the vagina-scented candle, you can get a vagina steaming service as an example. Or I think there was like a post for a while back about Snap, like the food stamps, and different people were posting pictures of what you could buy for $26. And Gwyneth very famously now, infamously maybe, posted a picture of like 7 limes, and people were like, that's not gonna, feed my family, right? It's not the purpose of this. Right. Do you have any thoughts kind of on that?
I do. I mean, look, I think not every brand is for every person, right? She's obviously not targeting some audiences. She's going to lose those audiences. I do think some of the criticism about price points have been unfair. If you look at her gift guide, and every brand has a gift guide, and you look at the gift guide for Neiman Marcus, which has like a G4 airplane in it, and no one criticized Neiman Marcus for that, like a gold-plated G4. It's not even just, like, those are excessive too,
Right.
but
Yeah.
because it's her, and because the brand is so associated with her, it's easier to just say, you know, she had a gold-plated juicer, and that was crazy, and you shouldn't have it. You know, she got the note, and I think the following year we called the gift guide, you know, something ridiculous, but ridiculous gifts, something like that. And it was because they are ridiculous, but it's fun to pick them out and it's fun to look at them. I just think it's not. I think building a brand, there's always a target for a brand, right? And a lot of time the target expands beyond, and that's how you build a really big brand. Look, when Sex and the City was launched, who was watching Sex and the City? Not all of America. There was a very targeted audience for that show, and you know, people buying expensive shoes and dressing up to go to restaurants. I mean, not everyone was watching that show. Over time, it expanded to include people, oh, we get it, we get the joke, we want to watch, we want to see. But that wasn't the target for that show. And that's true of brands as well. And I think it's true of Goop. I think Martha is sort of the opposite because she approached brands from a mass perspective.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, well, once you do mass, you're never going to be able to do that. Very fine. That's actually not true. She did a furniture line that was fine furniture. So I think it just depends on the strength. I think the criticism of, you know, someone picked expensive products to put on their website. Okay, don't read the website.
Do you think the reason that people call out Gwyneth, but they don't call out Neiman Marcus with like a jet, is because of the celebrity? Like it's, you know, there is a single person that I can say, oh, well, you know, I think this person is out of touch, versus I'd have to say an entire organization who I can't kind of point to.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in today's world, organizations get canceled too.
Right.
So it's a little bit different. I think that's changed some. You know, and she is a celebrity. Very famous movie star for a long time. And I think that does call more attention. It's also partly why people like to talk about it, because it's like people like to talk about it. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. What I really respect is the ability to take that, because that's not that easy.
And you don't have to appease everyone. Like, that's the whole point of your authentic voice, is if you just go with the flow and change your brand, there's no real identity as to what you stand for.
That's absolutely true. And I think you have to be willing to accept that and take criticism. And I always said about Gwyneth, like her or not, like her taste, you want to know what she thinks.
Yeah.
That's good. It's good for business.
Agreed.
Talking about mass and retail, you worked with Oprah. So tell us about how that experience was.
Well, the way we ended up working with Oprah was we were starting Oxygen, which was the intention was for it to be, this sounds very old school, but in 1999 it was not old school because the internet was just starting. And we were starting a television network, and we were starting an internet site. I say that because it sounds so silly now. You would never do that. And by the way, those were the only two platforms you were ever going to start anything on. And we wanted them to work together. We were very focused on what our web presence was going to be. And then when we got deep into the fact that we were definitely starting a network, a television network, we looked at each other and said, who's the most famous woman in America and who could get us noticed? Because the space was already crowded. And the answer is Oprah. So our other partners, who were Carsey Werner at the time, and my partner, Jerry Laybourne, and I cold called Oprah. And I guess at the time, they knew who those guys were. They didn't know who I was, but they knew who Marcy Carsey was. And she was a very famous sitcom producer. She did Roseanne, Third Rock from the Sun, Cosby, to have to say
More
that.
controversy.
More controversy now. And Jerry had been the CEO of Nickelodeon. So they had some television cred. And so when we called her, she took the call. We went out and we had a bunch of meetings with her. And she agreed to do it after some prodding. I do remember the first time I spoke to her, which was I asked her, the first thing I said in 3 meetings, which is unusual for me now, I said to her, so Oprah, we need to know, are you in? And she looked at me and she said, now I know why you're here. So it was a really good lesson for me because it was a lesson about a few things for me, which is sometimes it's okay never to say anything. You need to say what you need to say, and you need to ask for the order. And if you don't, and if we had gotten her from that table and hadn't asked, I'm not sure she would have been part of the network.
What do you think was the thing that made her interested in doing it? What was the tipping point for her?
So she was at the time still doing her talk show, and she really wanted a television network. She really did. Ultimately, I think it was hard to marry her interests with all the partners because she had a very definite vision of what she wanted the network to look like. And, again, we're all of a sudden, we're doing Talk Sex and Snapped. That wasn't really Oprah.
Right.
So I think at some point she decided she wanted her own network, which is exactly what she launched. But, I think at the time it was, here's an opportunity to work with people who had some history in television and start a network. And she was still very involved in her talk show. She probably didn't have as much time to do her own network. So I think that was partly what made her decide she wanted to do it.
I know who I think needs some of this right now is Ellen. Ellen DeGeneres, with the flack that she got for the culture she'd created, like behind the scenes. But it seems like an inflection point in her career.
Well, she closed the show.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine someone like her who had many years of being very loved in that capacity, might not be as public for a while, will come back and do something that's important to people and be reaccepted. Unless something, this is a different time we live in with, people canceling people without, in my opinion, I'm a former lawyer, so you are innocent until proven guilty. And
Not in the court of public opinion, apparently.
Exactly right, which I find a very scary thing for public figures because, either you spend the time to clear it up and maybe you win and maybe you don't. But, it's interesting because it really started with 2 very bad actors, right? We had Harvey and we had Bill Cosby, whose name now comes up twice in one podcast. How amazing. But those were very bad actors. And so you start with something that was very bad,
right,
or apparently very bad. He's been convicted, so I have no problem saying that. And then the other iterations of that may or may not have been as bad, but the association with it.
Yeah, it almost doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. And so, I think about CEOs today who are constantly under attack. I have a friend who's CEO tells me he has a camera in his office. He has a camera in his office because he doesn't want to have any...
Like a body cam.
Like a camera so that no one can make a claim about something happened in his office. That's what he's afraid of. And that's a horrible thing. I don't think that's a good thing. And I also think we've lost our sense of humor. I think it is impossible to make a joke in the office place without someone being offended by the joke. And so I think jokes are fun. And I don't know how you run all day.
You have to be able to laugh at yourself, too,
right?
You can't just be offended by everything.
Or laugh at someone else and making what you think might not be an offensive joke is so hard. And so I think it makes it really hard to run businesses today, too.
So, there has been a subtle shift, I would say, if you track what kind of Netflix has been doing with Chappelle and the controversy that surrounded his show. Ricky Gervais recently had a stand-up show that obviously riled up some people, to say the least. And then Joe Rogan, right? And platforms at this point are having to take a view on, at some level, freedom of speech and really saying that this is a platform. People are allowed to create the type of content they want. And if you don't want to see it, you don't have to. Or if you don't want to work here, you don't need to. What is your take on some of this stuff as it relates to, building brands and businesses?
I think the entertainment stuff is a little bit different. I think it's easier in the context of entertainment to say, you know what, it's freedom of speech. You don't want to go see Dave Chappelle's show. You don't want to watch it on Netflix. That's okay. think it's harder in the workplace to say, if you don't like what the CEO says, you don't have to work here, especially if you can turn what the CEO or any executive says into something that creates a hostile work environment. Right. So therefore, you have a right to be in the workplace. You do, and you have a right to say, I think that's a hostile work environment, and make a complaint. And then the company is in an investigation of whether it's a hostile work environment, it's not a hostile work environment. I think it's confusing. And I applaud the entertainment platforms for saying, this is entertainment, and that's okay. I mean, obviously there's a line. Right. We all know there's a line. I think it's going to become a very serious issue because I believe the Supreme Court just struck down a law and said they would hear a case involving whether social media platforms are allowed to censor. Yeah. And I think that's a pretty interesting one, and that'll become a very big issue. But taking it back to the workplace, I do think, look, we all want to go to work. We don't want people to say inappropriate things or do inappropriate things, and those seem obvious. I do think if someone raises their voice, I'm not sure I think that's a hostile work environment, but yet it can be considered a hostile work environment. And is it realistic to think that no one's ever going to raise their voice in the workplace? I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think to your point earlier, though, about like having lost our sense of humor as well, I think it's actually really, really important to be able to identify things like an actual hostile work environment, right? Like it's important, like the Uber controversy from a couple years ago, right? Like that's an important thing to get out there. But I think if you like I'm a big believer in, if you amplify everything, you amplify nothing, right? If everything is a high priority issue. If, Lisa makes a joke. If you make a joke of yourself, if you make a joke to me, and for whatever reason, I'm offended, but I do know that you didn't mean ill by it or whatever, but I make this into like a big circus, it means that if you actually did say something to me that was quite malicious, like how do I then cut through that noise that I've just created, right?
It's much more complicated today in the workplace than it used to be. I think it's harder.
Well, I think companies too are in a lot of cases forced to have a political identity when before it was perfectly fine of like the workplace was so separate from your personal and your ideological and all of those things. And now companies are finding themselves, if they don't speak out against something or stand up for something or what have you, the employees get upset by that and question, what do you stand for? And companies didn't need to have that identity before.
It's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
I think that was, I hope it's going to reverse a little bit because honestly, because I think that was when people were living, breathing 24 hours a day, just working together in an office where they didn't really have their own identity or have a channel to express that identity outside of the workforce. So every conversation was happening in this bubble. Now that workplaces have become a little bit more decentralized. People are spending more time at home. Maybe they're, balancing their work and life in a different way. They have creative outlets to go and express that opinion or that interest or whatever it is outside of the workplace and take the pressure off the workplace to work in the workplace and be a high-performing work team.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think the number of meetings that end up, in the last 2 years that have been on Zoom or Teams, it's harder to be offensive. You can't make those side comments. Harder to be offensive on that Zoom.
Because it's all on camera.
Yeah, it's all on camera. There are people who have found a way, but it's just, you're sitting there, you're not making, which is good and bad. You're not having those side conversations, which are fun, but it leaves less time or less opportunities for that to happen.
Yeah. What about kind of the blowback on the other end of the spectrum? So this is really kind of going back a few years now. But Pepsi is a great example of this, where they had that campaign with Kendall Jenner. Do you guys remember this?
Yes.
Where basically the long and the short of it is during a lot of, political and racial tension, Pepsi released this ad where Kendall Jenner walks up to like this police officer and like in the middle of a riot and hands him a Pepsi, and now there's peace on earth, right? Which is obviously pretty tone deaf for the audience you're trying to reach. Yep. And then for the audience that isn't who you're trying to reach, they're going to be like, what is this BS? Like, why is this even here, right? Do you think that on average we're kind of marching further and further toward those kinds of blunders because everybody has to have this political identity where it's well-intentioned, but you just should have kept your nose out of it to begin with? Or
That was a big blunder. That was the person who was running marketing, I believe, is no longer there, who was a good marketing executive. Look, I think there's two interesting tensions here. There's the ability of a community of consumers to respond to something that they think is inappropriate and decide, you're canceled, we're not buying your product. That's one tension. The other good thing is within companies, more and more responsibilities being put on companies to be good corporate citizens.
Right.
The more we focus on diversity and inclusion, the more we focus on CSR, corporate social responsibility, and other environmental factors, which are being imposed by federal regulators now,
Right.
Much more than they used to be, even to the point of regulations on forcing companies not only to think about their own footprint, their own carbon footprint, but their consumers' carbon footprint. So a good example is Tide. So how Tide gets used is a lot of times in hot water. Well, hot water is not as environmentally friendly as cold water. So we'd like to see P&G come up with a Tide where you can wash your clothes in cold water. And that'll be something that P&G will get measured on. So there's a lot of forces here that are good, right? There's a lot of putting more social responsibility on corporations in America to act responsibly is a good thing. The ability of consumers to affect change for companies that behave inappropriately, for the most part, is a good thing. And maybe it's going to drown out some of those no need to amplify individual voices issues where they don't really make as much sense.
Yeah. So I'm going to just call out the elephant in the room here. So at the start, we mentioned that you, had been CEO of Alexander Wang's brand, and obviously recently the company has come under fire for sexual misconduct. I'd love to get a little bit of, perspective from you, some of your thoughts on sort of how that has unfolded, and especially, from your position as a woman in leadership there as well. Do you have any thoughts?
I obviously these allegations came out after I was there, so I wasn't CEO at the time. I can safely say it wasn't anything I'd ever observed in the workplace. Alex is an incredible creative talent. He works in a creative business, which I feel like it'd be hard to avoid things like that because, you're sitting there, you're dressing models, you're undressing models. They're in the office late at night, pinning on clothes for a runway show, for a fashion show. I think anything could be said, but I don't know the truth of anything because when I was there, we were pinning models to walk down a runway, and that's what we were doing. And lots of people would be in the room to observe that. It wasn't a single effort. What Alex did outside the workplace, I wasn't there either. I do know that his passion and his drive is to make beautiful clothes and make people look beautiful, but I don't really, it's hard to know when someone makes allegations about something that happened. And to me, also having read a little bit about it, seeing the allegations really come through tweets instead of directly and something more formally filed, I find a little bit more challenging.
Cancel culture and the kind of like this notion of the baby getting thrown out with the bathwater
Right.
in the Me Too movement, where I think something that Jess and Sarah and I have spoken quite a bit about is really, what about the good guys, right? There's clearly a lot of bad stuff happened, and Me Too was a legitimate, real movement that needed to happen at the time that it happened. But so many of the good guys may have just gotten thrown out with the bathwater. And some of the corrective actions that have really happened around, young women not feeling comfortable asking a older gentleman to be a mentor, for instance, or vice versa, where that relationship actually might have been a really fruitful, genuine mentorship relationship, right? So there have been kind of like this the second order effects of Me Too
Yeah.
that have really actually in the end held women back.
I've heard that from a lot of people that they're reluctant to mentor someone because they're not going to take them out to lunch.
Happened to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would understand that. I understand why people feel like that. It's like what I said earlier, someone putting a camera in their office. I mean, that does go to another extreme, but sometimes you do need to solve bad problems with extremes. I understand that. But it's a hard one. It's a hard one to know what to do about. I do think working in the right company where the culture is set, the culture always comes from the top. Right. And so I think when you're looking for a job or you're thinking about where you want to be, thinking about what the top looks like is really important because they always say the fish stinks from the head.
From your perspective, is the top, like in that context, is the top the C-suite? Is it the board?
Is the C-suite.
Okay.
I don't think the board sets culture of a company, really. I think the board can push in certain directions, but it comes from the C-suite.
When you finished the Alexander Wang question, you ended on, this came more from like through Twitter rather than through like an official channel.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, how do you feel about that? Like, from a former lawyer, I guess once you're a lawyer, you're always a lawyer, but...
Recovering, we say.
Yes. But, like from the perspective of being a lawyer, how did you... I feel like you kind of have all vantage points here, right? Like you've worked directly with Alexander Wang. You are a woman in the workplace. You are seeing something that is usually filed through a formal channel now being filed on social media. It's not like you're foreign to media either. So I feel like you have a very unique position to kind of comment on that.
The only reason I think I commented that it was filed on Twitter was because I'm not sure why it means you want it to be public right away, as opposed to maybe going through channel where you can make a complaint that if it is substantiated, it can be carried through. Once you put it out there, it's public. It's now the burden moves to the person who's being accused to deny it instead of someone making a complaint and it's private. That's, I think, what bothers me about complaining on social platforms and making them public right away, because you're in the court of public opinion instead of a legitimate expression of a complaint where it can be looked at. I mean, having worked as a lawyer, very much pre the Me Too movement, eons, dark ages before Me Too. You saw lots of baseless claims being made against your clients. And I don't mean Me Too claims. I mean, I'm suing you for $1 million because you did X, Y, and Z, and the person didn't do X, Y, and Z. And guess what? The person being accused still has to defend themselves.
Right.
And in this country, you don't get paid back your legal fees. But it's still, for the most part, it's not as public. Yes, you file a lawsuit in court, it can be made public, but that's not the goal, generally. I mean, sometimes it is. These like fancy people who sue themselves over their fences in the Hamptons. Those are intended to be public and, disgrace their neighbors. But other than that, I mean, for the most part, I'd rather see it go through a legitimate channel. We have a pretty good judicial system in this country, notwithstanding the current Supreme Court, but we have a pretty good one.
Do you think that people intentionally want things tried in the court of public opinion because they think that, riling up the public is actually the way to get it done? Yeah.
I assume that's part of it. I also assume that, sometimes these things are so dated, they can't be tried in a legitimate court. And so that's the only recourse is let me just rile up the public. And, you get a really fast result. You don't have to hire a lawyer. You're not spending a lot of time. I mean, wow, instant results.
Right.
I've shamed someone.
Right.
Amanda Knox comes to mind. Remember that lady who had a trial by...
Yeah, well, that one's really hard to know because that was in Italy, and I'm not as familiar with the court system there. But yeah, that was very sad.
That's the one thing Lisa Gersh has not done.
Been a lawyer in Italy.
But I'd like to be.
Something to aspire to,
yes.
I guess.
I actually, at the moment, I'm watching a series on Netflix, and I hesitate to bring it up because I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Trial by Media, actually, that is what it's called, which is literally, it's a mini-series, and it's a docu-series, and each episode focuses on a different court case that was essentially tried in the court of public opinion, as well as in a court of law. It's just been really interesting to me, and it's really eye-opening just how much it actually puts strain on everybody involved. You know, it's not just the perpetrator or the person that, you know, you're going after. Like, you're bringing yourself into this whole, you know, media storm as well, you know, if successful in creating such a storm.
I mean, Johnny Depp and Amber
Right.
going on right now is like case in point.
Right. And it's just like, it's crazy to me how everybody has an opinion on everything if you put it in front of them.
Yes.
Like, you weren't there, you don't know, you don't have all of the facts.
Which is why when you try a case before a jury in a court, the jury, once it goes in to deliberate, is sequestered for the most part so that they don't talk to other people and listen to other people's opinion who have not sat through listening to all the evidence in a case.
Right.
Which is important.
I do wonder about, like, the jury for the Depp Heard case, though. Like, how could they possibly have avoided any of that? Like, did they
turn off their phones?
Yeah, did they put them in a jail cell for the last few months?
I mean, sometimes that happens in juries. They do keep people in hotels and they don't let them go home. It's tough.
It's crazy.
It's interesting, too, how much the way public opinion tilts can actually sort of impact your own personal thoughts, like on especially things that you don't have time to go super deep on, of like understanding all the facts. And then I feel like that just compounds on itself of it's like, okay, well, it seems like people really don't like her and really like him, so therefore.
But if you're a recovering lawyer, you find yourself like reading in detail every newspaper article about cases that you're interested in, so.
But that's why people like Lisa brought in to reinvent brands and change the narrative of the public opinion.
Exactly. Well, I think pretty good transition point of talking now a little bit about your background initially as a lawyer. I guess how did you what made you stop wanting to be a lawyer, or did that sort of transition come naturally, and how did you move into kind of the next part of your career?
How did you begin recovery?
Yes. You know, I don't think I ever stopped wanting to be a lawyer. I mean, I went to law school probably I kind of always thought I wanted to be a lawyer. I was very argumentative as a kid and always had an opinion. My parents always thought I would be a lawyer, but I kind of went to law school by default because I went to college and, you know, I didn't have friends who were going to like get me an interview somewhere, parents' friends or anything like that. And I knew if I went to law school and I graduated, I'd get a job as a lawyer, and that was a good way to get a job.
There's a defined path.
Yes, a very defined path, where lots of careers don't have defined paths.
Right.
I mean, I look at my youngest daughter right now who's working in marketing, and what's her defined path? Like, what's next for her? My older daughter went to law school and is a lawyer, so she found that defined path. So I went by default, but I really did love being a lawyer. I thought it's one of those things where you kind of learn how to think in a different way. I remember after my first year of law school going to the airport. And I'm going to the airport and there's arrivals and departures. And I'm looking at the sign and saying, well, I'm arriving, but then I'm departing. So where am I going? And I'm like, wow, law school's messed up my head. I was used to be able to go to the airport okay. I'll never forget that. It was so funny. But I loved being a lawyer. I was fortunate to have some colleagues who started a law firm very early on in my career, even though I went to a big law firm to start. And we started this law firm, and it was super fun because, you know, we'd get a client, we'd get all excited. It wasn't just the law part.
Right.
It was the building the business part that was really fun. It was a great group of people. And I was really happy. I was not thinking about really leaving. I had a client who asked me to represent her in an employment situation. She wanted to renegotiate her employment contract. And I suggested that she get someone who knew something about employment contracts and someone who knew something about the media industry, 'cause she's in the media industry. And she said no, because she felt like I would be her advocate, best of all. So I agreed to do it. And it became a very big deal. She left a very big job and went to the competitor company. And then, of course, everyone after she left thought I knew everything about employment contracts, which was not exactly true. I did end up doing a bunch of those, but I also did stay very close with my friend and client who then wanted to leave the job that I got her into, and she became my partner at Oxygen, which is how I ended up leaving. And I tried to tell her that I knew nothing about television and nothing about the media industry again, but that she was someone who liked people who were going to think really differently because they hadn't done something before, but there was a skill set that translated, which I think is true of a lot of jobs, that there's skill sets that translate into other jobs. And it's something I've found time and time again. I've spent a lot of time boring people in explaining how the media business and the fashion business are exactly the same, and I can really be boring about this, so I'm not going to bother. But the real point is, most businesses have certain elements that overlap, and if you're thinking about changing your career, you want to find the places where they overlap,
right,
and capitalize on them, so that you're not always saying, "Well, I have to do that because that's my career now." You can do that, and you might not even see the overlaps. I mean, I always encourage people to stay a little while in a job so they can find those overlaps. There's a tendency for people to leave very quickly. But the overlaps are important, and it really can be completely different business. Once you find those overlaps, you make the transition.
One of the common themes, if you look at your career, Lisa, is that you've worked a predominant amount of time focusing on the female consumer. Whether it was working with Oprah or Martha or Gwyneth.
We're on first name basis, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. At this point. And much of, in previous episodes, we've talked about women working in male-dominated industries. What's your take on working in a female environment, focusing on a female consumer, and working, in a female-dominated environment as a leader in those businesses?
Well, I think one of the big differences is when you start a meeting, you don't talk about sports as much, and you definitely talk about shoes. That was a key. That went across everything. I think when you think about overlaps, when I was talking about before, it's like, what are the common things? It's like, one of the common things is you're all businesses focused on females. And so that becomes something that you start to know a bunch about. You start to know more about how you're going to connect, what connects, what doesn't connect. So that's always been something that you can carry through. The workplace, I'm going to say, Oxygen was 70% female. Martha was probably 70% female. And Goop was definitely 70% female then, at those times. It's an interesting environment. I think you don't have some of the things that you might get in a more male environment, but you have other things. Like, there's probably more emotion in the workplace than there is in a male environment that you would see. I think people probably put their cards on the table more quickly. And I will always say that, I've always found this to be the case, that there's a certain level of efficiency in female offices, because it's like, I'm going to get here, and then I'm going to get there. I remember at Oxygen, I had our first investment banker who advised us in raising money, said to me, "You are my favorite client." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Why am I your favorite client?" Because I call you up, I ask you a question, you answer it, and then we're done. And it's usually one or two words, and we're done. I call them my male clients, it's like 25 minutes explaining. I'm like, no, okay. So I've always found that there was a slight higher level of efficiency, but that just may be my own personal take.
What about the negatives? Let's get a little spicy here.
I think there's been a time in the past where maybe women weren't always as nice to other women as they can be. And it might have been easier to be nicer to male. But when you're in an office at 70%, it's a lot. So I think I like spacing it up a little bit more. I think we tried at times to do that. But there can always be that.
Yeah, I think historically the reason that some women aren't as nice to other women in the workplace is because there can only be one. Like, there's only one seat at the table. If your organization is 70% women, then there's 7 seats at the table.
Exactly. That's why I think it didn't matter as much. But I think there's a different level of sensitivity that goes on. I think, men in the workplace can be pretty different. I think, one common characteristic I've always seen is men are, I want that next job. Mm-hmm. Women aren't as likely to say, I want that next job, even though they're definitely qualified for the next job. And, sometimes I have guys come in and say, I want that next job. I'm like, well, you haven't even done that job yet. Can we just wait till you do that job? And then we'll give you that next job.
I've actually had somebody who I will person who was reporting to me at one point in time, who will go unnamed. This was a while back, and he came into the company. We hired him in, and the very, very, very first conversation he had, literally it was a meet and greet with the team, and he said, "What do I need to do to have your job in 6 months?" And I thought, all right, kudos to you for being so ambitious, but also like, I haven't seen you perform in your job yet. Like, you haven't even gotten your IT set up yet. Like, let's just take a beat. Interestingly enough, I said to him, look, let's talk about it. Like, let's set up a roadmap for you. But let's talk about doing what you're hired to do first, and we'll get there when we get there. And he never actually got competent enough at the job that he had. He ended up being let go, because I do think he had maybe overfluffed his resume coming in the door. And, in hindsight now, when I look at how he was coming in, I'm like, I think so. But it's just interesting to me that like that confidence, I'll give him a round of applause for that. He's obviously his biggest champion, but I just couldn't see any of the women that I have employed, any of the women that I've worked with having that kind of, I'm 10 seconds in the door and I'm coming for your job.
I think that's one thing that as managers we can all do, which is to help the people who work with us and for us to understand what that roadmap is without having them walk the door and the first thing they ask, but to make sure they have that roadmap and to make sure they know what the expectations are. And I find like women aren't always as adept as asking for that as men I've worked with. But I do think it's really important as managers, especially managers of women, to help them get there and say, okay, here are the things, here's the path, and here's what you need to do. Look, I just had a conversation with my daughter yesterday about how to ask for a raise. And I said, go on LinkedIn, find out what people, because she's highly underpaid. And I said, go on LinkedIn, find out what people with your job title and your responsibilities are making, and write them down. And I'm not asking you to go to apply for another job. I know you really like your job, but you need to know that, and you need to bring that information into a conversation about what you're getting paid.
Right. I feel like we've entered a new era of transparency in that regard, which I think will be
100%.
super beneficial, because I think a lot of times, making a gender generality here, but like, women need more concrete information to feel comfortable going and doing something, asking for something.
Absolutely do.
Yeah.
And this brings us to our final segment, Ask the Experts. This question came from Twitter user Tiger Lily Marie. Her question is, I've spent my entire career in one field. I've been feeling a draw to another field, but I'm worried about the sunk cost. Should I keep building on a career I've invested so much in, or be willing to start at the bottom doing something else I'm more interested in?
I always think you should be doing something you're more interested in. And even when you say that you would have to start at the bottom, I feel like once someone gets in there with enough experience in doing anything, they'll quickly rise above the bottom. So I'm always in favor of having something in your career that you're passionate about, that you want to do. And everybody puts time into anything. People go to law school and then they decide want to be a doctor. There's a lot of sunk costs there.
You've proven you're a very quick learner.
But I think if you want to be, you are.
Yeah.
And if you want the experts to answer your questions about finance, careers, and women in leadership, tweet at us at Ask MoneyLion to be featured on the podcast.
So this brings us to the very end of the show. And we always end with a question for all of our guests. And that question is, what person has inspired you to roar the loudest and why?
I have to go with my mother. Never went to college, but has always been such a supportive and inspirational person to me. She's always let me think, right or wrong, that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And I think that was what let me think I could keep doing whatever I wanted to do, even when I didn't know anything about it. She always told me I could, and I believed her.
So thank you, Lisa, so much for being on the show. We've learned so much and couldn't thank you enough for being here and sharing your experiences with our audience. And thank you to our audience for listening and watching. Join us again for another episode of Women Who Roar.